second speaker, William Billy J. Press. Billy is a second-generation settler, person of color in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. They're currently a graduate student at the University of Toronto's Trinity College, focusing their research on anti-colonial methodologies and eco-theology, and works within their Anishinaabe medicine elders, Dr. Stella Blackbird, adopted Nokomis, and Audrey Bowen. Thank you, Billy. Welcome.
Bonjour, Genyu Danginandaki, Billy Nadishnakas, Bijun and Dodam. Gichimigwich, to this land and to all its inhabitants and ancestors in which Harvard Divinity School is living and working from. The space is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts nations, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Cambridge and Boston. I offer my asema, my prayers, my honor, my respect to the people and the Aki, or land or earth, and all the Nij Naniduag, or two-spirit medicine elders who sacrificed their lives and carried in their bundles the wisdom, histories, and protocols of creation and its lifeways in the Massachusetts nations. I want to begin with this photo to talk about ceremony and to talk about a story about tobacco, or asema. In the Anishinaabe tradition, where I've been adopted into and I work with closely, there's a tradition before we give a teaching that asema, or tobacco, is given. Before you do anything, asema, tobacco, is given. And I wanted to let you know here, for our conference, I did go to one of the elder trees on campus to offer my asema and prayers of thanksgiving, respect, and also petition for the wisdom that everybody is sharing at this conference, and that we may be able to integrate that wisdom into formidable praxis in our embodied lives. In the Anishinaabe tradition, it's all about introductions because it's all about relationships. So I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I speak from a social location as a queer non-binary mixed race settler, originally from Toronto, or Toronto, Ontario, Canada, in adopted relations with my Anishinaabe family, committed to walk alongside them on the Red Road, speaking to settlers, and specifically to settler colonial theology in particular. My hope is that what is shared can contribute to unsettling the dominant colonial theological frameworks, worldviews, and practice beliefs that we all work from and or have been impacted and marginalized by, and promote ways of being that do the work to center justice and resilience for the earth, its non-human members who are our kin, and those who live closest to them, our Indigenous siblings, and all other marginalized and oppressed community members by the hegemony of white supremacy, colonialism and imperialism, and extraction capitalism. This is a quote from my late Nokomis, grandmother's medicine teacher, Elder Mark Thomas. Creator put us on this earth to look after whatever it is where we're living. G di bendigman, we say, to look after it, to be caretaker of that land, to communicate with those animals, those plants, those trees, so they can show us their wisdom and knowledge for the medicine of our people, for the health and well-being of our nation, the Anishinaabe people. The above words of the late Ojibwe Elder Mark Thompson of Zagig, translated as the mouth of the river, First Nations in Manitoba, Treaty 1, is an oral teaching traditionally passed down through the generations by Geti Anishinabek, or the elders, and is shared among Canadian First Nations. It is a sacred teaching not only for the First Nations, but a teaching to be shared with all creation's members, and specifically with all humans who are considered the children of Niki Aki, or Mother Earth, or Gaia. Unfortunately, the above teaching, similar to wisdom offered by an ecologically conscious Christian tradition, continues to be challenged by the dominant settler colonial culture in North America. And very quickly, I'd like to just define what settler colonialism is by Richard Horvath's definition. And Richard Horvath says settler colonialism has three major elements. That's one, domination over territories and behaviors of other groups by the migration of permanent settlers. Two, exploitation of the dominant territories' natural and/or human resources for extraction and profit. And three, an enforced culture change process involving destruction of indigenous lifeways. There's a great need to address both the oppressive experiences of First Nations communities and Aki, or the earth, through unsustainable environmental and cultural human practices. The oppression and violence experienced by the earth and its indigenous communities are interrelated because Anishinaabe lives, indigenous lives, identity, history, language, traditions, and ceremonies are intimately tied to the land, making the land's experience their direct experience. Anytime there's environmental disaster, the first humans to suffer are those in indigenous communities across the globe. There are broken relationships between humans, settler or non, and also with and among non-human Earth community members. All members live alongside each other and within an interrelated ecosystem, and yet it is the ignorance, denial, apathy, and abusive natures of the dominant settler colonial culture that continues to acquire privilege and power at the expense of the earth and its indigenous nations. These relationships need to be reconciled, and a new way of being must be cultivated that is giving for all members of creation. This quote by Harsha Walia: rather than debating the dichotomy of victim or oppressor, we have focused on cultivating an ethic of responsibility based on understanding ourselves, non-Indigenous, as beneficiaries, intended or not, of an illegal appropriation of Indigenous peoples' resources and jurisdiction. Whether we define ourselves as migrants or settlers, it is undeniable that we are on lands unjustly seized and are complicit in a culture that sees Indians rather than settlement as the problem. There is an urgency to change how theology functions on individual, communal, and structural levels from both a theo or thea ethics and theopraxis perspective. This urgency is called from the marginalized voices of those who suffer the impacts of colonialism and racism, and ecological destruction and environmental racism. The goal for this study is to give an introduction to a theological method developed on the foundation of a theology of relational accountability, or TRA. As a settler theologian who is accountable to and in adopted relationship with my Anishinaabe family and community, this theological method is written for other settlers to consider and to be challenged to integrate its method within their own methodologies and hermeneutics that inform their theoethics and praxis. Because of the deep-rooted colonialism that has captured the consciousness and lives of dominant settler colonial culture, there's an urgency to make the concerns of both the Earth and First Nations primary because of the geocide and indigenocide that continues with dominant populations left ignorant or in denial to any of these realities. There's a great need to address both the oppressive experiences of indigenous communities and the earth through unsustainable environmental and cultural human practices. Humans are accountable to one another and to the Aki, or earth, because they live upon it, which is literally the grounding for their context. Even with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Christian communities, there's still a huge void in the minds and hearts of settler Christians to pursue authentic and just relationships with their cohabiting Indigenous neighbors, as well as Earth's life systems. The primary reason for the lack of implementing the TRC calls to action and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and theological work in particular is that in turn it would impact ecclesial and cultural norms within Christianity. Not everybody wants that. It is because the normative theological methods that frame these theological relations work from a colonial paradigm, which is not compatible and are oppressive to indigenous worldviews and teachings. So Christianity and the colonialism that has shaped its theology is relationally accountable to the harm it has inflicted upon the earth and its indigenous peoples. Because of the contextual needs of our time regarding decolonization and navigating environmental destruction, a theology of relational accountability that focuses on an eco-centric and anti-colonial method is needing to be considered for implementation in all theoethical disciplines. And I use the term anti-colonial rather than decolonial as a settler. But as a settler, we can help support decolonial initiatives and praxis for our indigenous people. So that's the differentiation between the usage of the two terms, decolonial and anti-colonial, by Randy Woodley, who I'll talk about in a moment. Okay. To take up this urgent call for settler Christians to reconcile their relationship with creation and indigenous communities, what is needed is a theoethic that begins to cultivate and center both this eco-centric and anti-colonial method that will frame the contextual theological work and praxis it implements. In order for theology to center the interrelated concerns of the earth and its indigenous peoples, implementing a TRA is essential in one's theological method. This theological method centers justice for the most systematically marginalized members of the earth and its First Nations, and challenges normative, dominant settler theology to integrate an eco-centric and anti-colonial theological method. A TRA must begin with a method that implements contextual and intersectional theologies, which creates space, specifically liminal space, within one's theological framework to recognize the importance of having to cultivate a relationship by spending the time and energy to do the work in learning and application. This TRA must embody eco-centric and anti-colonial methodologies which teach that all things are interrelated and each member of this relationship is always accountable to one another. Everyone is always relationally accountable to their contextual relationships, if they are aware of it or not, or even in denial. The TRA methodology has the ability to provide any theological discipline to begin discourse on theology and justice because of its primary focus on a global-wide scope of oppressed earth members and its indigenous peoples. Right. So this study begins to introduce its theological method through the usage of, and I've listed some of them here in this study, contextual theology. So there's a great scholar named Angie Pierce, intersectional social theory, as well as intersectional theology. And three of my favorites that I've incorporated are Vivian May, Patricia Hill Collins, and Grace Jason Kim. Specifically, Anishinaabe epistemology from Leanne Betasamukse Simpson and Darcy Rolt, who's also Lynx Clan, which I'm part of. He wrote epistemology called Anishinaabe Nino Imatsubun, which translates as the way of the good life, which is very similar to this concept of love and how do we live a good life? Well, it's about loving our neighbor as we love Creator. Decolonial and anti-colonial research methods, and in particular I focused on Sean Wilson, which I'll introduce to you in a moment, and their relational research method, and indigenous theology of Randy Woodley. Randy, I'll show you a picture of their book. A new book just came out 2 weeks ago entitled Indigenous Theology in the Western Worldview, and you'll be able to take note of that new book that I've incorporated in my work. And of course, a selection of eco-theological hermeneutics, and the hermeneutics that have been created through works of Thomas Berry, Norman Wurzba, and Cynthia Malhotra. Right. So this is one of the indigenous research methods I've used in most of my work, and in this study in particular, by Sean Wilson, who happens to be a high school friend of one of my Anishinaabe mentors back in Manitoba. So the world is quite small. Their methodology is taking 4 of the axes of research methods and starting to explain how each axis is always related to one another. So starting, of course, with ontology, epistemology, axiology or ethics, and then methodology. And they're all interconnected. And because this is a two-dimensional diagram, it would be better if it was 3D, that arrows or vectors would be connecting all of them from different angles. And next one. So here's Randy Woodley, who has a great permaculture organic farm here in the States. And this is his newest book that literally just is hot off the presses. And in the quote here, Jesus, like every Jewish person, would have included land as part of his own understanding of who God is. Narratives around place naturally compel us to define our social location in the story. A non-local theology, a more abstract theology, makes it easier to ignore social location and place. This Western view encourages an objective view of reality over a subjective view of reality. Like the only things that matter are those that we can prove, as opposed to our thoughts, our hearts, and our experiences. In this work and in some other works, Randy quotes Jairus Grove a lot and coins this term, the Europatrisine. So we've heard of the Anthropocene, but this is even more specific, where we start to talk about how it is the Eco-Centric, patriarchal frameworks that the world has been conditioned out of, and a lot of our methods work from. So it was a European elite that developed a distinctively mechanistic view of matter, an oppositional relationship to nature, and an economic system indebted to geographic expansion. The resulting political orders measured success by how much wealth it could be generated in the exploitation of peoples and resources. The geological record bears the mark of this European assemblage of hierarchies. Understanding the forces of Europeanization, the forces of racial superiority, economic hegemony, and global resettlement is essential to understanding how the planet got to this point. This project of, again, extraction capitalism and the unfortunate method of colonialism is at the heart of this worldview and framework. Right. Lots of words, lots of terms. I want to take our focus now to a short film to help us have a sensory journey about connecting in relationship. And this short documentary is based upon my late nokomis, Dr. Stella Blackbird, and Audrey Bone, who are the medicine elders that I work with in Manitoba. Let's see if I can do this.
Riding Mountain National Park of Canada is the traditional homeland of the first people known as the Anishinaabe. For generations, our Anishinaabe have been gifted with a traditional knowledge that provides healing from the plant life that surrounds Riding Mountain. The plants that live in the area are seemingly endless, and among those that commune regularly with them are 3 generations of Anishinaabe medicine women, 2 related by blood, each by friendship. While it is said that these plants hold special healing qualities for the body, they do much more than that. They also form the bedrock to spiritual, emotional, and cultural rejuvenation, not only for those who receive them, but for the women that tend to them.
I grew up in a residential school, and on a daily basis there was abuse. First day we went there was very hard. We were lined up, and that was when they cut our hair. I used to have long hair, braids my mother made. I could never go past this when I told my story, because our hair are very important. They're the antennas to the spirit world, to the Creator. And then I developed this shame towards my parents, and shame how I look, shame of my skin. I was ashamed to be an Indian. But over the years, I did a lot of healing. And today I know I'm not a savage. Today I know our people were very spiritual, unlike what I was taught, unlike that shame I took. Today what brings me at peace is picking medicines. For the last 30 years, I've been doing that, traveling here and there to find me where I belong. Today, I belong here. I'm one of those trees, the grass. I'm part of everything. I do belong.
Residential schools weren't the only institution to suppress the beliefs and practices of the First Nations. With an aim towards preservation, conservation, and recreation, the government of Canada evicted the Kisco Anishinaabe from a reserve located on the shores of Clear Lake within Riding Mountain in 1936, and forbid anyone from utilizing the plants for over 60 years.
I guess I felt very hostile towards Riding Mountain National Park because they didn't understand what the medicines meant to us. The medicines out there were given to us to use, to survive, and for that to be taken away from us made me very angry. I didn't let that stop me. Even though we were not allowed to go in there at one time, we still went. I make juice out of them. They're good for cleansing your kidneys and for healing. When we got our land claim settled and we were, I guess, given the freedom to be able to go back on our land, it was a relief to me. That's healing. That's reconciliation by saying in words, I'm sorry we took away all of this from you, but it will no longer happen.
Today, there's a mutual understanding and respect that is growing between the Anishinaabe and Parks Canada. Both Audrey and Stella now work with the park staff in understanding plant medicines and sharing the ancient knowledge about this very important part of our identity.
To find that connection our own way, through our ceremonies, all our ceremonies, our sweat lodge, our Sundance, our vision quest, everything is within that circle, and getting all that back and, connecting with the plants, the trees, the animals. I really believe that is what brings me back into balance and that circle of life. The generations that are ahead of us, or people even in my generation, they don't have any knowledge of this because of what happened, because of the residential school stuff and all that. It's important because if we don't pass this knowledge on, it's going to be lost. Our children are not even going to know it existed.
Raspberry, strawberry, and sweetgrass, sage, blueberry, rabbit root, black root, and hyssop, mint, bergamot, hero, goldenrods, silver willow. When I was small, like a baby, my grandma, she knew I was going to be the one to pick with her.
Go this way a bit. Okay, put it down.
Having a dream of my grandmother and giving me tobacco and saying, you need to take these young people back to that place.
Usually I'll see wormwood and sage. And mostly I can't really see sweetgrass because there's a bunch of grass.
See, look at this green. See, that's sweetgrass. It looks different than the other grasses are more dull. See this one right here? These are all sweetgrass, but they're quite short here.
So when you see a braid of sweetgrass, there's many teachings about it, but one of them is the young men coming to manhood. The mother braided their hair, and they would hum a song, and it's man, woman, child, man, woman, child. And when you look at the sweetgrass after it's braided, it only has two. You never see the third one. It's the man and woman and the child to come. They have a purpose, these plants. They are brothers and sisters and relatives, and they have a purpose like we have a purpose to survive, to heal one another. And the plants know that's their gift to us.
You know, it's the same as looking at a human being and seeing how special they are, what special qualities they have, the special gifts they have. The plants are the same.
Teachers say that every person that comes with an illness, there's a plant to heal them. We harvest love, and it's hard work, but it's a satisfying, humbling experience that the Creator is working through you, teaching you. We do it to help people.
Because it helps people.
To help people that have no sense of purpose in their life, people that are suffering from different emotional and mental problems, you know, practicing the violence that they are and using all the drugs that are destroying their bodies. The healing powers of our medicines are far, far better than what's out there because of the spiritual power of that plant and the way that it is given to them and administered to them is different because they're taught to use it with respect.
And we always put tobacco before we honor Mother Earth and the plants, the tree life, and we call them the standing people, the trees. They watch over us, and they're always standing straight, honoring the spirit world, and so does all the plants. It has everything to do with our being, all the sacredness. You could look at the tree and you'll see many shapes of animals in that tree. And same as the plants, like there's plants that you know right away it's going to help the heart. Here there's strawberry, because it's a heart medicine, one of the medicines, and it has vines, see, growing from plant to plant, and that's how our veins are in our heart, in the body. There's another one called coltsfoot. It's grown all around here, and it's shaped like a lung, and it helps the lungs.
It's the cough medicine. We dry the leaves and we crush them, and we boil about 1 to 2 tablespoons and about a pint
water. We mix it with maple syrup.
My place here is to make sure this is kept going. I can't do that much now, but I do my best to help. But when other people come, I'd like to teach them so they can carry on. And so these plants will always be there for us. And one of the teaching I've learned was if you don't use those plants, they will not grow there for very long. So we do our best to pick here and there to make sure that our relative comes back to be with us and help us for the summer.
Thank you so much. This documentary is really, just really close to my heart, and everybody who's seen this. And
Can you say a little bit for people that watch or I sent a link out to them separately.
thank you. Okay.
Just give them like 30 seconds to get it.
We're all good. You all can hear me? Okay. This video is very close to my heart, and a lot of the community at Eco-Centric in the Riding Mountain National Park, of course, because of the late Dr. Stella Blackbird. How I met them, and I'll be very quick, just because of time, I want us to have some Q&A time, is both Stella and Audrey came to Toronto, and they offered a training in Indigenous herbal medicine. And a lot of us were drawn to them, and I went up to them and I asked, how do I honor you? I'm a settler, I work in the church. Look, what is the best way for me to act? I wanted guidance from them particularly. And they're like, you know what? Come to us and be with us. So it took me a year to find them because, it's not like they advertise on their website or anything. And I journeyed out there, and that was about 8 years ago. And in being in a relationship where trust can be built, where somebody like myself can actually commit to the work that needs to be done, that's at the heart, or at least the first stage of reconciliation, right? Only if you're invited. That's the other thing. We tend to forget. Sometimes we think, oh, okay, well, I want to go in and fix things, right? And that's not the way. Sometimes your fixing is not welcome, and you need to wait for an invitation. So by Creator's grace, in my case, I was invited in, and I continue to work with them to this day, and I'll be going to see them finally for the first time in 2 years since the pandemic. My community, and mourn my Nokomis, which I haven't had a chance to because she died during the pandemic. Okay, to close up, I want to just throw some questions to you, just to take home. One, and maybe this can be discussion in the Q&R. What are some potential arguments for not wanting to consider a method like this? Is there, as settlers, for example, or people in different traditions, religious traditions, Christian and not, is there something, is there a resistance? And my question to you is to ask yourself, where is that resistance coming from? Another question, how does your method and theology inform frameworks that benefit at the expense of marginalized groups, such as Earth systems and its members, Indigenous peoples that are in direct relationship with the Aki, or the Earth? Again, to reiterate, everyone is always relationally accountable to their contextual relationships, if they are aware or not, or even in denial. One event, if I had a little bit more time, there were 3 different situations. And if you haven't heard of Grassy Narrows, please look up Grassy Narrows. It is the mercury poisoning event that happened decades ago, where the government of Canada lied to the Indigenous communities, and there, of course, is intergenerational trauma and death. because of poisoning. And this event I was at in 2018 with David Suzuki and Leanne Simpson, and of course Judy De Silva, who is leading the bringing of awareness to this problem. And I will let you know the update today, 2022. There hasn't been much change in regards to government help, even though the government of Canada has promised to actually provide the money for the physicists and chemists to come in to help remedy the waters. Okay, I'll close with this quote, but before that, another very important announcement that just happened. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who is basically the head of the Anglican Church of England, is on a tour to Canada to come to listen to Indigenous communities and possibly offer an apology. As an insider to the functionings of this kind of tour, I will let you know the unfortunate thing is that a lot of the Indigenous communities were not actually consulted before this tour was approved, which means there has not been consent from the Indigenous communities where listening and a potential apology wants to be made. So, and that includes 6 nations in Ontario where they have refused. So the board, the ministry that I sit on the board of directors for, Toronto Urban Native Ministry, has rescind our participation in helping to plan on this tour, and as an act to remind our Ecclesial Institute that if we had a theological method or theology that really wants to do the work to be accountable to not just the history, but to the present practice, consultation and then consent, invitation is at the core of all of this. And without that, more trauma will happen again and again for more generations. So this is another reason why a technical field as method, right, is actually at the foundation of a person's practicing their belief system. So this is my nerdy methodologist mind encouraging all of us to be like, okay, where are the frameworks? What's the method that I am working from that informs my life and practice? So my favorite Anishinaabe scholar, who was in that picture as well, Leanne Simpson, we need to join together in a rebellion of love, persistence, commitment, and profound caring, and create constellations of co-resistance, working together toward a radical, alternative, present based on deep reciprocity and the gorgeous, generative refusal of colonial recognition. Wichita Biziguang, we lift up in liberation. Zemak, a prayer. Right away, we must do this. Amen. Gichinigwich for Harvard, for Dan, for Natalia, your team, for this land, for allowing me to share and all of us to share. And thanks to my partner, Oris, helping beautify this presentation with all the design. Miigwech.
Thank you both so much. I'm going to begin the question and answer with a question that was posted in the middle of your session, Eric, and then open it up to those of you in the room and those of you on Zoom. For those of you who are in Zoom, if you want to go to the Q&A tab and put a question in, or feel free to raise your hand and speak, either would be great. And for those of you in the room, raise your hands. I'll call on you. So this is from John Halstead. Hi, Eric. I've been participating in and observing naturalistic religious communities for a couple of decades, and it seems they all seem to struggle for similar reasons. Rationalistic religions struggle to motivate people. It seems to me that there's a correlation between the success of a religion and the degree to which it taps into the irrational and the transrational. Do you agree? And what are your thoughts on how this applies to Gaianism? Okay.
You might want to stop the screen share.
Oh yeah. Think about that.
Thanks, John, and a great presentation that you made earlier today as well. For me, I feel like Gaianism, you drew the 3 circles on the screen, gods, magic, and earth. I feel like, for me personally, Gaianism drops 2 of those and really just zooms in on that one earth circle. That doesn't mean the magical or the enchantment has to go away. I feel like some of that comes naturally, embedding ourselves in nature, in the meditation process. But I do recognize my own limitation or perspective. Being a sustainability researcher has really emphasized the rational, and I'm hopeful or naive that there is a place for a rational-ish religion in the world. Although I know you've written much about UUism and the weaknesses there, overly rational. But I do feel that Earth is so magical in its natural beauty and the fact that it is a living entity. Many people say we're on Earth, but we are in Earth. And that is so mystical in its own sense that I think that for me is enough. And perhaps in a decade or 100 years this will evolve, and there will be layers upon layers, or maybe a branching sect of Gaian mystics, who knows. But right now, for me, just understanding Gaia and connecting with it in its infinite forms is kind of the enchanting element for me.
Thank you. Are there any other questions right now? Yeah, Giannis.
First of all, I just want to say that Billy is incredible. I specifically got over my conference fatigue to come and hear this talk, and I want to really thank you so much for doing a robust job of making the wisdom that we don't really have access to conversational with the Western Academy in an attempt to open up understanding, because that's extremely difficult, and you're just doing a fantastic job of it. I had a question that I wrote down during the middle of your presentation that I think is kind of a counterpart to one of the questions you asked for us to take home, which is, why wouldn't we do this? And I know I'm not quoting you directly, so please excuse me. And so one of the things that I constantly ask when I see a fantastic presentation like this, or talk to very intelligent people who are extremely excellent specialists, is, being very in touch with the conservative forces in North America. How do we open up a conversation where we can convince, trying to be polite and diplomatic in the way that I say this, but where we can convince people who are very concerned with soteriology that native wisdom and pagan wisdom and revivalist pre-Christian European traditions and First Nation traditions, and my partner is actually a Salish person who was also, is now very much westernized. I mean, it's all very complicated. How do we convert with soteriology in the common culture that, if you'll forgive me for perhaps being slightly vulgar, kind of amounts to afterlife insurance? Because we, all the presentations here have just knocked my socks off at this conference, including Billy's, but how do we talk to folks who are just like worried about what happens when I die, and how do we open up our hearts and empathy to that, to talk about how concerned we are for them as they are. I mean, it feels like sometimes condescendingly speaking from a personal perspective of us, and I know that's quite a lot to answer right now, and I don't expect perfection, but I would really love to hear your thoughts on it.
Thank you, Miigwech, for that question. And and your Thanksgiving for reception. Okay, my answer, short answer first, is the Sunday school answer. For those in the Christian world, it's not necessarily Jesus, but it's equivalent. It's about relationship, which goes back to my thesis about relational accountability. Because in order to have conversations that are so vulnerable, that really is at like the core of a person's experience and how they live, in order for a dialogue to happen, there has to be some platform of trust, so that the hearts of the questioner and the recipient can actually dialogue with one another. That's a shorter answer. When we talk about like salvific, soteriological kind of discussions, the other part of that question is what is the platform you're discussing on? Right? Is it on individual to individual basis, or is it in a communal basis, or is it from institution? So I think, again, coming to be contextual in everything that we do, even that kind of dialogue, let's say here at the Academy, I can present a paper or give a presentation and throw a lot of words and ideas, right? And I'm not gonna have intimate relationship in our dialogue with each person here or online yet. Hopefully that helps to encourage relationship building outside of this space, right? So then the question is, okay, how, first, do I have capacity to answer this question at this time in that place? If I do, great. If I don't, then who do I bring around with me? So here's a question. Here's an equivalent. So in my anti-racism, equity, anti-oppression work that I do at U of T, the whole question about anti-racism and white supremacy. How do you communicate these justice issues or equity issues to, if we're going to use your example, more conservative, people who have not even had the time to work? Maybe you have to get somebody who is more accessible for that person. Let's say somebody who is white, who has come from that experience, to be an emissary in a sense, to hold that space to communicate. For me, my theological work, I'm like, well, if I'm a settler, then I am responsible for doing as much work as I possibly can to embody some sort of work to build relationships. So that's why I went out. That's why I spent the time and energy. So then my goal is, as a settler, to talk to other settlers. So there are these different platforms and different kinds of relationships, but it does come down to relationship cultivation in contextuality, with hopes of trust so that things can flourish. I hope I was able to answer a little bit.
That was a fantastic answer.
Paloma.
Yeah. Oh, I just want to echo what I've been hearing, the beauty of what you presented, and it's also just the quality of your being as you have been sharing it. And I want to ask a kind of stupid question, I guess, in a way. It's like so basic, it's kind of, but I feel after hearing and feeling so much over the last few days, when you say doing the work, I'm wondering if you would just sort of break that out a little bit. And especially in light of when you described how the Archbishop of Canterbury coming and in an intrusive and non-mutual kind of way. I just wondering if you would talk a little bit about your own work in this, and when you talked about being invited rather than initiating, just what that process has been for you and what transformations in your own work have taken place.
thank you for such important and empathic, feeling-oriented, embodied question. I'll start by this. There's a lot of information at this conference, right? So when it comes to digesting and assimilating what we're learning, the first thing we need to do is actually self-care. So that self-care is going to look different for every person. So my encouragement is if you don't have one, ask yourself, what kind of cultivation practice do I have? If that's just sitting in just silence, right? Or if it's a whole list of different cultivation practices. And if you have questions, I can always answer those for you, but self-care first. This idea of my journey, I was waiting a long time, most of my life, for invitation to learn about my indigenous siblings on Turtle Island. And I don't know if that was my upbringing where, for me, I'm half Korean, maybe it's my mom's, influence of, waiting to be invited, right? And not imposing yourself. Which was very counter to the evangelical Christian bring up of this idea of Messiah complex coming in to save the day. We gotta fix things, which is the MO of our culture that we're working out of. So I waited a long time, and it's funny, I feel like I traveled the world in order to come back to Turtle Island to receive the teachings of my elders and my community that I love so dearly. So how do you get, maybe the question is, how do you get invited? Or how do you do this work? Again, going back to today's Sunday school answer, which is about relationship, right? So how do you cultivate relationships? To do that, that's the work, right? The work is to cultivate the relationships with others by making yourself available, going to spaces that are open first, that are publicly open. There are a lot of public opportunities, indigenous communities open for everybody to come join in ceremony and celebration, and to commit to keep going, but to keep going so that in authenticity, because not only out of duty but out of love. Like you want to have friends, right? Friends make relations in love. There's no formula except for how do you create space to have relationships cultivate so that trust can be built and then co-creation can manifest. I think maybe I covered some of it, and if I didn't, we can talk more after, but hopefully that was helpful.
Anyone else? Yeah, please.
Thanks very much. This was a really lovely session. Lovely to hear both of you. Essentially, it's leading the way into solutions, and with some real similarities about needing community. One of you having a method to find and connect with existing community and relationships, and the other, as I see it, finding a way out of no way, starting with a very intellectual background and a piece of committed, heartfelt work, and then creating your own healing path. One of the things I'd like to ask you to think with us about is where we began this conference. Ron Taylor brought up the question of paganism. In my work in life, I see that as a category and one that is used in an exclusive way to denigrate people and to claim here's my religion, which is a real religion, no matter how much we honor the dawn, or any other aspect of nature, but that there's a line when, if you become pagan, you are on the other side. So there's a power in that categorization. But I wondered if either of you, but particularly you with your choices, Eric, could reflect on where you stand in terms of how those categories do or don't serve your project or inhibit your path.
That's a great question and an ongoing question. Again, listening to John Halstead earlier today, there are some in our community that were pagans or helped in the pagan movement, but felt pulled away from that community because of the God focus or the magic focus, because they weren't naturalistic pagans, to use that term. I wasn't exposed to that. I grew up Christian, and that was I didn't have the negative feelings toward paganism. It just wasn't really an influence at the time. But for me, what was an influence was deep ecology. And I got frustrated with that when, Arnon argues that we should all have our own eco-Sophie, which for me feels like, then where's the community? Right? If everybody has a different way. And then that combined or coupled maybe with Gaia theory and recognizing that mystical kind of reality, those two merged. And so I actually felt in my own personal search, I was trying to find what would work. The pagan community didn't really resonate because of the magical, I guess. And I recognize that I didn't do enough homework. And in fact, even now, I continue to find sister organizations like a Green Spirit in England, which kind of evolved in the 90s, and if I had found it through a better internet search, I might have, just joined them, although it's only in England, right? But because they're doing very similar things, and they have local groups, and so there are real kind of, the more I'm in this space, the more I'm discovering how many people are seeking out similar paths, and that's exciting to me. But I don't have a satisfactory answer to. I mean, I'm not pagan averse. I self-identify as a pagan. I'm somewhere working in parallel, I guess, and I don't mean to. It's just this has kind of evolved beyond me now, and that's kind of where it's gone.
Thank you for the question, and you stirred me on to an answer of, I think because I'm mixed race already, I embody some sort of intersectional experience. So that kind of already began my journey of what does it mean what is identity, but then also what does it mean not to co-opt things as well. So this is my identity, but what is outside of my identity? What does it mean to be a Canadian, being, Korean and Greek? But then what does it mean to be a Korean, Greek, Canadian who is in relationship with their Anishinaabe family, and not to co-opt without, on any level, right? So that's why this idea of relationship building and trust is built. But for those who don't have such embodied intersections, like where does that leave me? It leaves you with who you are. So this idea of self-journey, self-identity, and learning what it means to walk alongside all of your siblings in this life, right? Rather than trying to adopt, culturally appropriate, take things for profit or any form of benefit, if that be fiscal, emotional, or even spiritual. That is the journey, right? That's, I think, what we're called to do, at least the settler community is called to do when it comes to creating spaces, using our power and privileges so that Indigenous people can have space for resilience and resurgence, and for us not to get in the way. Literally, we have to clean up the mess, and then step back and support and hold. And let them lead. Let them lead. How do we walk alongside each other together as we are invited to?
Thank you both so much. This is really just such a moving session. It really embodies everything that we're hoping for in this conference. just in terms of creating a space where people are creating new things and also doing new things in ecological connection to very old things, to really, do that alongside one another and be friends in the different things that we do. I do have a specific question for you, Billy, because you were just talking about your own intersectional identities. And I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on the relationship and distinction between settler identities and migrant identities, which I guess I would understand to be the difference between groups of people who claim land that other people are on for their own and make up new rules in ways that are deeply harmful to the indigenous and people and indigenous ecologies, and migrants who come, often as a result of their own experiences of displacement into other societies, quite often settler societies, not to dominate, but to accept the rules of the society to which they come. How do those two fit together, and how do those create different paths to relationship with indigenous communities?
Thank you, Dan, for bringing that question into the space, because this is such an important question that is being talked about more, and which is why when we have those who are immigrating and traveling, and probably because of being displaced, where's their place and their relationship with indigenous peoples of whatever land that they are migrating, living, and working out of? It's hard for those who are migrating from a different culture into a settler culture to adopt certain rules and frameworks imposed on them. They're in a tough spot because they carry their stories and their traumas from being displaced from a different land, looking for a better life. But the gift in that is this displacement, is that when they are able to enter those open spaces that indigenous communities from whatever land they are living and working out of are invited to, they share a common, one kind of common experience, that is being displaced, being traumatized, right? And unfortunately, it's a relationship, or at least a meeting place, where there can be empathy when stories are shared, and which is why narrative work, narrative theology, right, is such medicine in a methodology, because we need to hear the stories in order to know who we are. So for those who are migrating, they carry in their bundles so much stories. They embody the traumas, and when meeting and intersecting whoever indigenous nations are in the land that they live, may that create softness and empathy in their hearts and bodies to actually nurture a relationship between those two different people groups. And for the States, for Canada, for Europe, there's immigration, and then we see all this pushback against immigration in different contexts. These are great harms, right? Whereas, what does it mean to be hospitable? Part of hospitality, what you do in hospitality is you eat together and you share each other's lives through story. And that's how relationships are built. And depending on what the stories that are shared, hopefully that their further relationships can be cultivated in that. But those who do embody more intersections, there's more work. It is a little bit more complicated. It's more, I'll take that back, not complicated, and more dynamic, the work, which speaks to how I think we need to continue to push back and deconstruct binary, dualistic worldviews and frameworks. Nothing's black and white, nothing's yes or no. Everything is contextual, and like I said, part of the methodology is what does it mean to live in this liminal, in between, ever-changing space. And we see from creation in the different ecological spaces in creation that most of life actually is co-created in these in-between liminal spaces, and let creation teach us. And as well as those who live closest to creation, let us learn from them to see what does it mean to be in this liminal space, which is so medicinal. Yeah. Thanks.
I can say it from here.
No, the remote on it won't be able to hear you.
Thank you. Two questions. One is, there's a curriculum called Sacred Earth. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but ironically, it's actually been created within the Episcopal Church by folks who have been slave traders in the past and are seeking to deconstruct that, but also create a sort of interactive learning place to do the work that we've been talking about. So one is, are you familiar with the Sacred Earth? And I'm wondering, from an Indigenous perspective, if you think it's in the right spirit. And then secondly, I'm wondering about your vision. What if this work begins happening more and more within settler, colonial, Christian traditions, or in other ways, secular contexts? What's your vision of what could be possible, or what does health healing look like ultimately? Yeah.
Such great questions, and I wonder if Eric wants to jump in at the end too, because it's community oriented. Okay, one, no, I haven't heard of Sacred Earth particularly in the Episcopal Church, even though I'm part of the Anglican Church of Canada, but from what
Sacred ground.
Sorry, Sacred Ground, thank you. But I'm going to infer maybe an understanding of, from what you have shared, that there might be a desire for settlers or for those slave traders, let's say, for reconciliation. This is what I'm going to say. We always have to take lead from those who are victim to such crimes. We have to take lead for them. And even no matter how much we want reconciliation or want to do work to kind of make things better, you have to wait for the lead. You have to wait to be invited, because the people may not be ready, which is another example with Archbishop coming to Canada and not getting actual explicit consent from the communities. Do not impose, even though that there is such genuine desire to fix things. That's the problem. You're not supposed to fix everything, because you're also working from a framework where that you already have, you don't even know where to begin. You need to be led. You need consultation on how healing can happen. So that's my outsider theoretical answer to work like that. Take the lead, and until then, you've got to wait, and that might take generations to wait. My vision. Indigenous communities in Canada have no potable drinking water. They don't have access to healthy food. They are dependent on boxed, high preservative, high sodium food. We see the health deterioration of the history of Indigenous people across Turtle Island, diabetes, cancer, all of this. Grassy narrows, for goodness sakes, with the mercury poisoning. My vision is bare minimum. What do we do as privileged, powerful settler communities and a nation to actually advocate and do the work to create the infrastructures to provide, not us providing and giving resources, no, fixing up the messes that we made so that creation and the earth and the ecosystems can heal, and that Indigenous communities can actually heal. So not us doing anything, but again, cleaning up the space. But how do we do that? We need to take lead from them. Have that desire, and you sit waiting and praying and offering tobacco and doing your ceremonies, asking for grace for the opportunity to be able to have guidance to do the work. Wait, wait, wait.
You said it. You said it.
Hi, thank you both. I really enjoyed your talk. I learned so much, and so I'm grateful for that. I just had a comment. Feel my heart beating fast because I think about the condition of my community, and I think about how I've witnessed some people claiming to want to help, but it really is about their own needs. It's self-serving, really, more than it is about doing what I would say is the more honorable thing, which is gifting. What can you gift to these communities? And I think about the immediacy of the need, like you were talking about, not having clean drinking water, or in the work that I do about the missing and murdered women and Two-Spirit peoples, that is so, in many circles, just so every day. We have to warn our daughters, we have to warn our children, and have to worry whether we're going to see them or find them, or if they're going to come home. So I think I speak more of expediency. I can't wait. I mean, I can't, please, at least in through my eyes, do you want to help? Email your local legislators, get involved in going to the spaces where you have power, where nobody will listen to me, nobody will open that door for me. How can you provide those spaces and create, for example, a place like this, where I can be at the podium and I can tell you, I need you to not wait. I need you to find ways to actively search, but be aware that you might not be invited, but why is it? And instead of getting upset, recognize and learn about the history. Get educated. Maybe there's a reason that a group of Native women don't want a white man in the room. You know, look at the statistics. And so I think that in that way, getting educated, we're all educators, maybe not all of us, but to some degree or another, if we're in spaces like this, we have the capacity, if we don't know, to get educated ourselves. And once we have that knowledge, to incorporate it into the work that we do in one way or another, so that way at least the voices come into the room. Because it's not necessarily every day that you're going to get the Indigenous people coming into the rooms. And so I just wanted to share that because, you know, when you said waiting for generations, in my mind I'm like, oh my God, no, don't. Like, you know, what can you do now? And you are correct. Don't, the whole savior or, you know, the white savior mentality of like, you know, coming in. We don't need that. We know what we need and we know what we lack. Ask in a genuine way if you want to ask. If you're not trusted, be patient. But in the meantime, still be resourceful. Still, you know, gain that trust, that maybe you didn't break that trust But there is so many generations of mistrust because of broken promises and broken treaties that you can't blame us for not trusting and not being safe, not feeling safe, not bringing in our sacred knowledges. You know, I brought my skirt yesterday and I shared it with them. I brought my skirt. Maybe I didn't contextualize it, but what that meant was I brought my medicine. I brought what was sacred to me because I felt the safeness, the genuineness, the kindness, the compassion that is not everywhere. And you cannot be vulnerable in spaces all the time because it requires vulnerability to be able to share our ways, because it's always been attacked, always been stolen. You know, we've been exterminated because of it. We're at the point of that. So in order to share, it has to be a space that's inclusive. Anyway, I just wanted to share that because it just, in my mind, I'm like, okay, don't wait. Anyway, thank you.
There's a question, it's a great question in the Q&A chat, but I think that seems like it's an appropriate space for us to leave. Thank you, and thank you for all that you all brought into the space and following this conference. I want to stop recording, but before I just want to take the moment to give you all a word of applause.